Hello, hello. I am Allison Zamuda, and I am joined by my usual compatriots, Art Costa. Hi, Art. And Benna Calick.
Hey.
And we are so excited to start our holiday edition. Our live conversation is going to be around thinking about your thinking, metacognition. So, one of the things as we started to think about the schedule for the month of December, we do know that sometimes people think that thinking about your thinking is a little bit heady, a little bit esoteric, but we actually think that this spirit of holiday season is starting to reflect and think back on ways that we can shed a little bit more light in some of the nuances or territories of each of the habits. That's what we've been doing over the past 6 months or so with each habit. So in this way, we're going to start thinking about metacognition, thinking about your thinking, to actually start to generate not just an inner dialogue, but also in the external world, the opportunity to leverage metacognition to cultivate a sense of belonging. So whether it's with your friends or your family during this holiday season, whether we're thinking about the last days of being in the classroom, the opportunity to continue to grow this capacity is something that we are going to spend some time on today. So, Miss Benna, we're going to start off with you. Let's come up with just a basic definition of what metacognition is.
I have to start thinking about my thinking. I'm sorry, you have to give me a minute or two. But metacognition, if we think about it, meta, it's about, and cognition, thinking, it's about your thinking. But what's interesting about metacognition is it's about the way you think about your own thinking. It's that kind of voice that goes on inside your head. Do you ever find that when you're in the middle of a conversation with somebody and you sort of think it's going a little sideways, that you start talking to yourself, that you say, whoa, maybe I shouldn't say this right now. Maybe I have to think about saying it a little differently. This seems like it's kind of a tense situation. Maybe I need to relieve it with a little bit of some kind of humor. All of that's going on inside your head. You know, I find that one of the things that's so remarkable about teaching, when I was teaching, and I know what teachers' experience is, that metacognitive voice is going on a lot inside your head. While the students are doing one thing, you're thinking, oh, I'm noticing that Art really isn't paying attention. Maybe I need to go over there and coach him a little bit. You're talking to yourself. You're making your observations. You're thinking about your thinking. And what's amazing in this holiday spirit is that in the holiday spirit, it's a wonderful time to not only feel like we are so excited. It's Christmas morning. Our kids are so excited. But maybe we can also get them to just slow up for a moment and say, what's exciting about what you're seeing? Tell me more about how you're experiencing this. How are you feeling right now? In other words, metacognition is not only about how I am feeling, but also how I'm observing how others are feeling. And that means I have to find a way to make their thinking visible in the same way my conversation with myself is visible.
Well, it's interesting because, as we continue to have conversations about all of the 16 habits, which we each love individually in terms of their dispositional flair and what it adds to becoming a more thoughtful individual, a more thoughtful community. Oftentimes, the three of us quietly think metacognition, thinking about your thinking, is like the macro one. It's the one that is it's not necessarily the pinnacle, but it's the umbrella. It's the overarching frame. And I think, Art, I want to bring you into this. Why is metacognition so important from an overarching point of view? Why does it have that level of impact? And by the way, Brian Horner, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us with this holiday party. And he said, I love how Allison said that metacognition can be heady, and then immediately follows up. with the esoteric conversation. So, but yeah, trying to keep it real, Brian. So thank you for participating. And again, keep those thoughts going. But Art, why is metacognition so significant?
Well, because all of our actions require some kind of self-awareness. It means that you are in control of your thinking. It means that you are aware of, and therefore you can control your thinking. For example, have you ever had a student in class who blurts out an answer? Well, and you know that's impulsivity. Well, the impulsivity comes about because they didn't control what they were thinking about. In other words, they spoke up, spoke out without thinking. And so what we want and what everybody needs to do, I think, is to take charge of their own thought processes. Now, that's not easy because, first of all, we are born with the capacity for thinking about your thinking or metacognition, but that doesn't mean that all people do it. As a matter of fact, it's been found that some people are not aware of their own thinking. We have also found that students and others who come from impoverished environments might not be aware that they are thinking inside their heads. And so part of our goals in school is to teach kids to be aware of, to take control of, and to be conscious of their own thought processes. So one thing we want to do then, as a result, is to help kids learn how to share what's going on inside their head when they're solving a problem. So as teachers talk with the kids, ask them those kind of questions. So how did you solve this problem? And you'll find very often the kids just says, "Oh, I just did it." Well, that's not quite good enough. Tell us about the steps that you took. How did you start? How did you know how to do that? How did you go back and check? So all of those questions that involve students thinking strategically, those are the questions we want them to respond to. So kids get to be aware that they are thinking, they are problem solving. And furthermore, that all kids don't think exactly alike. So in a classroom, we want to go around and find out how did you solve the problem? How did you solve the problem? How did you solve the problem? And so we are aware of the problem-solving process, and we're also aware that not everybody solved the problem in the same way. And by listening to each other's thinking, we also gain perspectives on our own thinking and ways to improve our thinking.
It's interesting because I love Art that you're bringing it directly into the classroom. There's another example that has happened over the past couple weeks between me and Benna, and one interesting thing is Benna and I continue to try to organize our management in terms of Google folders and Google files and that kind of thing. We sat very diligently for close to 36 hours together, physically side by side, setting up a structure. And so sometimes, as Benna was saying, like, okay, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And I was like, Benna, I just need a moment. I just need to process. I need to think. And in my mind, I had to go into my inner working, trying to figure out what's the logic, what's the approach, how am I starting to set it up? Sometimes you need to have that kind of cone of silence before you can actually start to process out loud why I was setting it up this way and whether or not it worked. And then it actually turned out this morning as Ben and I were walking through trying to look and figure out we could find a file. The idea was I turned around and said to Benna, okay, now trace back starting from the beginning how you started to approach the location of the file to start to see if the organizational system that we built was working. Right. So the interesting dynamic is that it starts to feel like the inner world and the external world. The idea or the goal might be the same, but the process, the need for quiet, the need for external validation, the need for conversation and action, that really starts to cultivate both the me in terms of inner dialogue and structure and logic, and the outer conversation, the sense of we. So Benna, I'm just gonna throw it back to you in terms of chatting about that as another example of metacognition.
Well, I think it was such a dynamic one for both of us because we 99% of the time agree on what we're trying to do and very often don't agree on the process of getting there. And so I thought it was really interesting to kind of have to, first of all, I think it really requires executive function for both of us. It was your executive function that was saying to you, I need the cone of silence before I say anything. It was my executive function saying, don't be impulsive and ask her all the time because she's not ready to tell you what she's thinking yet. And so I was restraining, you were restraining, we were working separately. When we came together, what was interesting was how we made our thinking visible. And the way you thought it made sense was not the same as the way I would have thought it should make sense. And between the two of us, we came up with making sense out of the text of what we wanted to say so that we could both find it. And that's what it seems to me is so important about metacognition also, is that you're developing a language of description. You're developing a language for process, and that you're not expecting everyone will understand your process. But then the question is, if you're working collaboratively, everyone needs to understand each other's process in such a way that you come to some better understanding of what you're doing. It's such a beautiful way of thinking about the idea that it is so critical when we are, especially now, I feel, when people are using, for example, an emoji to tell you what they're thinking. Oh, I'm happy. Whoop, I'm sad. Oh, you heart. I love this. All the things that they do don't really tell us more than that they had the instinct to put an emoji there showing I'm feeling this way at this moment. But what you really do need to know if you truly are caring about the communication is, tell me more about that. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me why this excites you. Tell me what it is about this that you're thinking about. I think it's that whole conception of not shortcutting, but actually talking together about process that is remarkable.
So,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that those all the questions that Bennett was asking are all very powerful. I like to add one to it, and that is that we ask others, so what's going on inside your head when you came up with that idea, or what's going on inside for you when you are feeling that way, so that the internal thought processes and feelings become external. We can't get others to empathize with us unless we make those feelings or thought processes known to others. So it takes some skill to get them from here out through our tongue. And believe it or not, this is just a little bit of a side, but scientists and zoologists have often wondered if animals metacogitate, because in some instances we find that it looks like a dog or an elephant or some of the higher animals actually are thinking, but they can't examine that because we don't have the words. The animals don't have the language to be able to express their thoughts. And so we think then that maybe only humans have that capacity to express that thought. But that's the difference, because we can get our thoughts known and expressed to others, and other forms of life cannot. It distinguishes us and why we are at the top of the chain, I guess, when you think about being human, that one of those attributes is the fact that we can communicate what's going on inside our head when we are thinking, and other forms of life cannot.
Yeah, and Art, Brian's sort of reflecting to one of your earlier points about having the capacity for metacognition doesn't always necessitate action. And I think it's an
That's correct.
interesting moment in that I think the power of cogitating is oftentimes having, like, I sort of imagine it's like a voice looking down on your thinking. I mean, that's another way of starting to imagine or describing it. It's like you're tracing your own train of thought and beginning, like, I think, like, on some level, it's the reflection aspect of thinking about your thinking that is so incredibly powerful, and sometimes even more powerful than the impulse to action.
I certainly agree. And psychologists have found that while we all have the capacity to think about our thinking, not everybody does think about the thinking. That's what's interesting. In fact, children who come from impoverished environments, or it shouldn't be children, adults also in impoverished environments, lack that ability to think deeply about their own thinking. They don't have the words in their head to express it. And so in a typical classroom, for example, you have the good fortune of students being able to express their thought processes, and you should get them to do it, but don't expect all kids to be able to do it well.
Yeah. No, I just want to give a shout out for people that are just joining us. Welcome to our holiday edition. We are focusing on thinking about your thinking. And we're talking about the idea of both the inner world of thinking about your thinking, as well as the outer world, and the way of making sense of one another and being aware of how others are thinking. So I actually wanted to circle back to something that Barbara added, if we can pop that back up again. The idea, and something that Benna, you were starting to talk about, the idea of having a common language. Now, we've spent, Art, Ben and I spent about 6 months or so messing around with the idea of emotions. And the opportunity is not just sort of the tongue-in-cheek, what Benna was describing a minute ago about the emojis, whether it's like the frowny face or the face doing, it's really starting to think about very clearly, when I describe how I'm feeling, I'm doing so in such a way that it feels like it's resonant with that particular emotion, if that makes some sense. So if all you have in your vocabulary is something like happy, mad, sad, bad, there's a level of nuances that is missing, and Ben and I was thinking about our trip to Finland.
I just was thinking about that. Yes.
Can you describe that a little bit in terms of what?
Oh, it was so remarkable to all of us. Heidi, you, me, Marie, we were there, and we went into this second grade classroom, and they were doing writing, and they were doing a whole lot of writing. But then what we were intrigued with was the word wall, because the word wall wasn't the typical word wall that we usually see in a typical in the States kind of word wall of words. It was all feeling words, description words, adjectives, ways to express, ways like, we always say, can you elaborate on that? Well, how are you going to elaborate on that if you don't have the language for it? Yeah. And that was such a beautiful way of showing how they get the students to talk about emotional response, a way of seeing what they see and describing it the way they can. And I think when Barb was talking about the idea of co-construction, co-design, you see that in this word wall, you're now developing that common language in your classroom. And then I see that Brian is saying, yes, not only describing it, but how do you then coach for it? How do you coach for these questions? How do you really say, tell me more about it? And I have to say, I was so impressed on the book that I read, that I'm sure many of you have seen, Monica Guzman's book called I Never Thought of It That Way.
Mhm.
To me, that was such an impressively interesting book because she, a daughter of an immigrant family who had a very different view politically than her parents did. And she was trying to think about, how am I going to have conversations with them? You know, we're talking about holiday spirit, and we're going to be with families, and it's going to be that we may not have a common language for how we're expressing what we want to say. So the metacognitive then becomes, in a way, prompting questions, but the prompting questions are questions of curiosity, of real, honest, authentic curiosity. You're not navigating to find out whether the person is thinking about this versus this. You're really curious to know. And I loved her term. I never thought of it that way, because it's kind of like saying, you know, now that I heard what you have to say, I never thought of it that way. It doesn't mean I have to agree. It doesn't mean it's something that I think is right or wrong. It means you have opened a portal to your thinking that has opened a window for me to understand more about how you're thinking, what you're thinking, why it is being said in the way it's being said. And I think there's just such a beauty in that curiosity about, what is it that the other person is thinking? I know so often we find that we make assumptions about what we think they're thinking without really having that genuine curiosity to know. Tell me more about it.
It's fascinating because as you were describing that, Benna, I just jotted down the word vulnerability, because it's so interesting to start hearing you describe it in that way. Because if I am opening my mind so that you can actually see what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, the most gracious act is to respect the vulnerability of the person that gave you the opportunity to have that experience. And so I think that's all the more reason why, when we're starting to think, Art, about the conundrum of the assumptions that we might make in our head as somebody is being vulnerable and opening up their thinking, sharing opinions, feeling evidence, how might we step back and start to check our own assumptions about what we're hearing?
Well, let me just say a couple of things about what you just said, and then I think is what you said is what gives an organization or a culture that sense of belonging. When I can express myself and share my inner thoughts without ridicule, without contest, without people laughing at me or criticizing me, but rather they accept them, that really creates a culture in a classroom or a school or a home or an organization in which people do feel like they belong and that they are appreciated. And so there's really two parts of metacognition, as we've said before. And one is that I know my own thinking, but also I'm inviting the thinking of other people as well. And they soon find out that their thinking is safe with me. I'm not going to judge them. I'm not going to criticize them. I'm not going to evaluate them, but rather we're just having an open discussion about what's going on in our heads. How did we come to think about the way we are behaving or the way we're acting or thinking? And it creates a bond between two people that we share not only our feelings, but our thinking as well. So it's a very powerful tool that we can all use to build a rapport with other people.
That's a very dramatic ding. So I'm not quite sure who's.
I'm not sure where it's coming from. I don't think it's me, but I don't know.
I
So
message on my computer.
Okay. Hey, hello, message on Art's computer.
Yeah, see, I mean, when Art says something important, his computer dings. We understand. That's another way of getting at metacognition. When you have a thought that's going on inside your head, it goes bing.
That's right. The light bulb is being turned on. And Benna, I mean, I really do want to sort of tease out the idea of metacognition and listening with understanding and empathy, because there's such a beautiful synergy in what I was hearing Art start to describe. But there's a dimension of metacognition, I think, that is so much grounded in the mindset of what Monica Guzman was saying. I never really thought of it that way, focusing on curiosity instead of judgment. And I think the moment of assumptions, I think that's the circle as to where we are sort of diving into now. So how, Benna, do assumptions actually sometimes lead us astray, sometimes sort of offer another small step to continue to get deeper into the conversation? Talk us through, Benna.
You know what? I just have recently had a really very powerful experience that I'll share that I think kind of addresses what you're thinking about. But what really was interesting, it was a group of teachers, and we were all talking quite openly about our practices. And we were talking about sharing about some things that we were concerned about. But we had built a lot of trust in this group, and so it was very open, and people were having a very good dialogue about it. And one teacher said, she was a math teacher, and she said, I know that the process-oriented math, she started off by saying, I've always been a chalk and talk teacher. She was in teaching over 30 years. I've always been a chalk and talk teacher. And now I'm being asked to pay attention to process. And I'm really having to give students the opportunity to process their thinking. And I'm listening and I'm seeing that if I let them go, I'm so nervous because I think I should really be helping them see what they need to do. And so I'm so torn. And then she said something so powerful that only happens when you're willing to be vulnerable in your sharing your thinking. And she said, and what really disturbs me the most is, I don't know what it means to be a teacher. How am I supposed to behave? How does it look like I'm teaching when I'm just watching kids and they're doing it on their own and processing it with one another? And that just seemed like such a moment in terms of her being vulnerable with the group. But also, interestingly enough, someone said, I really thought you didn't like doing the math that way. I thought you were really feeling like that wasn't what you wanted to do. And it was just that moment of appreciation for, I had a false assumption about what you were experiencing because I hadn't taken the time to ask you, how were you feeling about this change? And there's that moment where we make assumptions that because this person doesn't fit in this pattern that we think is the right pattern, then we just assume they're resistant, they're not doing it, they don't want to do it, whatever. And it's just the beauty of being able to just say, I never thought of it that way. It is really, in fact, interesting to feel like I was always a teacher in control. Does it mean I'm no longer in control? How do I behave? I thought it was a very powerful example of checking assumptions.
I think it's so powerful. And then I'm thinking about the idea of, well, what's the opposite of metacognition? And I was, as you started to describe that, and again, as you started to talk about the idea that people might have thought something else or something different, I think it's habituated thinking might be the opposite. Art, how does that resonate with you? The opportunity of, like, as Benna started talking, it was like, oh, like the idea of like feeling like you're on autopilot, that it's routinized. Your thinking can actually become routinized, which means that it functions well in certain circumstances, but it sort of starts to crack and be less useful in other circumstances.
Well, There's a lot going on these days in neurodiversity. And we know that we have diverse students in a classroom or diverse people in an organization. But what makes them diverse is the fact that they think differently, they act differently, and they think differently. And you don't really understand or know another person until you've probed something about the way they're arriving at conclusions, the way that they are processing information that might be shared, the way they are communicating, how they choose their words, for example. And so taking the time to probe and ask others, invite others to share with them what's going on inside your head as you think about it this way. How did you choose to do it that way? What are some other ways you might have done it? All those questions to get at what's going on inside them is very important. We don't really know another person until we have explored with them their own thinking processes. And so it builds a sense of belonging, it builds a sense of diversity, it builds a sense of appreciation for the variety of ways of thinking that compose a group. And if you don't do that, you miss an awful lot about the people that you're dealing with because you haven't probed them to find out how they arrived at a conclusion or what's going on inside their head. So ask them.
And Ben, I mean, you were making a gesture a moment ago. You were doing something like this. Can you recreate that for a minute? So when you're starting to have body language signals that are being physically displayed, another thing that Ben and I spent a significant amount of time conversing about is even the body language that is visible may or may not line up with the assumption that you say in your head about what that actually meant. So when Ben just did that a minute ago, do you know what I mean? Like in my head, I was like, oh, she's cogitating and she has something to say. But that may or may not be accurate based on the expression that she was trying to generate. So I think the notion to me as well is starting to think about sometimes when we see visible cues, even though we're not hearing spoken language, also may or may not line up. So there's a whole range of assumptions that we have that I think sometimes people, especially me, can get trapped in their own mind. So they're having multiple conversations inside and outside, which is utterly dizzying and sort of takes you out of being in the present moment.
Allison, when you play poker, that's called a tell. A tell. In other words, you have a scratch of the head. I notice that Ben often does this, and it tells you something that's going on with her. It might be trying to remember or whatever's going on, but you don't really know what those little signals are until you probe them and find out.
Right. Oh, it's interesting because we did have a session on gathering data with all senses.
Right.
And that's what we're really talking about here is, you're being attuned. You're really making sure that you're paying attention to any signals or signs. But the lovely thing that I know I can trust from the two of you, if not others as well, would be that if you thought I was doing something that was like, are you thinking of something and not saying it? You probably would ask me. I trust that. So I think that whatever it is, we know because we have such a close relationship that we're going to really pull out the best thinking from each of us as we go. And I think that that's the hope, is that when you're in a learning organization where everyone is really both vulnerable to learning and also interested in new learning and is also feeling a little shaky that maybe this, I hear people saying it all the time. I'm only talking out loud, as if all of us were not talking out loud. Or this is just first draft thinking, as if we all had written a document before we came to the conversation. But I think we all feel almost apologetic for our thinking, rather than feeling confidence in the fact that we're just sort of putting and making it visible to explore our thinking, to be curious about it. to wonder about it, to allow ourselves to be questioning about it. I think that's, kind of the real sense of belonging that people can get, is to be able to do that.
Well, when the three of us get together, sometimes we need to say things that don't take a lot of planning. In other words, I haven't thought about it an awful long, but I'm feeling it right now, and so I say it. But we all have an agreement that we can do that with each other because it enriches us. That doesn't mean we have to hold on to those ideas, or it doesn't mean that we have to live by them, but rather that we appreciate the sharing of those ideas because it reveals something more about ourselves. And it takes a great deal of trust and openness and appreciation and vulnerability for me to do that, or for us to do that.
So, I mean, what's happening as we're starting to model this in real time is that there is a clear conscious intention when the three of us get together, whether we're planning for a live call, or we're discussing an important current event topic, or we're planning for a particular article. I think the moment is that there's space for, and this is truly part of metacognition as well, space for both action and reflection. When the conversation starts to move too fast, it starts feeling a bit dizzying. It's not because we can't keep up with the speed of thinking. It's because there's too many things happening. And so I think the other interesting part is starting to step back and consider, when does it need to slow down a bit? When do we need to pause and like step back and look at it another way? Or when do we need to step back and sort of consider, tell me a little bit more about why you're feeling the way you're feeling right now? Or you're all riled up. It's like, when you're that riled up, it's what's happening for you right now? Why is this emotional? I mean, so I think those are the interesting dynamics when it's thinking about when we're growing this notion of a culture of belonging, whether it's the three of us, whether it's a family conversation during the holidays, whether it's a one-on-one moment with one of your dear friends. The opportunity to really be present in the moment so that you can start to see like the waves of action, reflection, and interaction.
Right. And what you said, Allison, is it really comes in three parts, or maybe more. But there's a good deal of planning, as I'm sure the audience knows, that the three of us get together ahead of time and plan these webinars. And so I build it in my head, a plan of action, which we share, and I'm review those and think about the words that I'm going to say ahead of time. And then, of course, we have the webinar, and we all talk and share. And very often, after the webinar is over, we call each other and say, how do we do? So we think about our thinking beforehand, during, and after. And so that's an awareness that we build, that we are conscious of what we're going to say, and we plan it and we think about it. We don't always follow it, but we think about it ahead of time. And then as we are conducting these, we are thinking about what's saying and how does it connect to what went in the past and what's coming up. And then when we get all through, we reflect back and say, well, did it work or didn't it work? Or how do we do it? Here's what we should have done differently. And so there are three opportunities to control your thinking and to think about your thinking and to alter it either along the way or ahead of time, or as a result of doing it, you won't do that again.
One of the reasons why I think we said at the very beginning that metacognition is sort of known as kind of the meta of all the habits.
Right.
The habits won't work without meta, without that awareness. But what's also what you were just saying, Art, about the planning, the processing, and then the reflection. In the processing especially, it's the awareness that brings in the other habits. Like, for example, you say, what's going on here? It isn't quite working. Or as an example, you might say, the fact that there was the ding from your computer, finding humor. We were able to sort of find humor in that, to move it along and move it forward. We have our way of being able to see that consciousness of the thinking and awareness of the thinking, we say, oh, I never thought of it that way, and I need to be thinking flexibly. You begin to get this sense of how the other habits really do depend on a level of awareness. And that awareness then brings in the other habits to work, in concert with it. And if you are good at beginning to learn how to think about your thinking, you are not only controlling your thinking, but you are building your habits.
Yes. And I think that's really a strong point, that when we talk about metacognition, it's not just my thinking, but it's the realization that you are thinking also, and that needs to be brought up and shared both from my point of view and from your point of view. And until we have both shared our thinking, we really haven't communicated yet.
Yeah.
Or we communicate more when we do share our thinking that goes into it. So don't be afraid to probe others, to say, tell me how you're thinking about that. Tell me how you arrived at that. What led you to these ideas? What effect does that have when you use those ideas? And so we're building the awareness of their own thinking, and to apply the thinking to their everyday interactions with others.
And Barbara is offering a beautiful reflection that she loves the idea that belonging plays a role in establishing a common language, and unpacking a common language reveals a culture without perspective. And I think that the significance of this is truly how we continue to cultivate a sense of belonging, regardless of who we're in the room with. So there's one more moment, and this is something, Benna, you and I chatted about as we were getting ready for this call. I think it was on our walk yesterday or this morning. We started thinking about the intersection between metacognition and mindfulness. And so I want to sort of try to recreate the general distinctions that we started to make and see how that resonates with you, Art, to get you into this party. So when we started to describe the definition of metacognition, so Benna, can you roll back what the definition of metacognition is from the opening part of our hour?
It's being aware of your thinking. It's being in control of your thinking. It's the meta of your thinking. You're thinking about your thinking.
And we were having a conversation that, so when you're starting to think about the intersection between mindfulness and metacognition, I was describing with Benna that being aware of your thinking is the meta part, and it depends on what kind of mindfulness or meditation training you're engaged in. But the notion of being aware of your thinking so that you can actually not be trapped in your own thinking. So the meta actually gives you space so that you can start to see that your thoughts are, clouds passing in the sky, as an example. You're not trapped by your thinking. You can observe your thinking. And so I think the interesting dynamic is that sometimes metacognition fuels us and helps us engage in more thoughtful problem solving, as an example. Yeah. But sometimes when you're starting to think about the connection to mindfulness or meditation in this space, the opportunity is to notice that you're thinking, and not to stop thinking, but to recognize in that moment. If you can see that you're aware of your thinking, you're in this moment, not trapped or stuck in your thinking, even if it's just for a split second. How's that resonate with you, Art?
Well, some of the Eastern religions, I can't do it, but if you practice it, you can, and that is to not have any thinking going on, to absent the metacognition. It puts you in another state that the Eastern religions talk about and describe. If you're fortunate enough to be able to control yourself that much, and they can. People who grow up in those religions have that kind of sense of control, I think. But it's very difficult to not think, to clear your mind, to go absent for a while. It's something that we don't often do, but it can be done. You can control your thoughts, or you can control not to think, which is it takes you to another plane, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on my meditation practice for a couple of years now, and I think the interesting dynamic for me is that when you become aware that you are thinking, some meditation teachers say just label it as thinking. So I can be down a rabbit hole of thinking about going to the airport to pick up my daughter, and is there going to be traffic? When you start going into that line of thinking, if you stop and recognize and label thinking or thought, and then you take a breath and begin again. And even in that split second, you may be off in a tear in another direction in terms of where your thinking goes. And again, it's just be aware, stop, take a breath, and see what comes of it. So to me, metacognition, when it comes to being aware from a mindfulness piece, we're trying to lean in to be in the present moment. Benna, how's that resonate with you?
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason I was thinking a lot about it was because of the work I'm doing with EJ around the question of mindful movement, because it's really interesting to me that I always would do my exercises as exercises. And now I'm able to do them with a metacognitive component to it. I'm not only doing them, but I'm becoming more and more aware of why I'm doing them, what I'm doing, how it feels to me, and how I am in control of monitoring that and doing it. And the other piece that I've learned from all of that is that being aware of what you're doing doesn't mean that you're aiming for perfection. It just means that you're paying attention to whatever it is you're doing and really recognizing that each time you do something, you're getting a little better at something. I think it's that whole idea of the pursuit of better rather than the pursuit of perfection has really played a role for me in terms of thinking about your thinking, being aware of it, but making sure that the voice that goes on inside your head is really a voice of positive self-talk, so that you actually are able to not only have the metacognitive, but also have the capacity to encourage yourself by realizing that, every small incremental move is a move.
So in the pursuit of being
control.
Yeah.
So in the pursuit of being better, it's just such a joy to spend some time with you, as always, Benna and Art. And looking forward, Benna, to EJ and the work that he's doing with you. If you haven't started to think about signing up for the conference on April 7th and 8th, this would be a fabulous time to take a look at that on our website. But the opportunity to hear a little bit more about the notion of self-care, the care for others in your organization, in your family, and the link, as Bennett just started to talk about, between habits of movement and habits of mind is something that we're going to explore on day 2 of the conference. Any final words to wish everybody a happy and healthy season and new year? Art?
Well, I echo that same thought. This is a time of year of Christmas and Hanukkah, and when we're all together, and monitor what goes on in your head, monitor the feelings that you're having, monitor the joy that you're experiencing, monitor the bright lights and the mistletoe and the candles and anything that grasps your attention, because those are cherished over time. These are things that you'll always appreciate if you pay attention to them. Take your mind and pay attention to them.
Happy New Year, happy holiday, Merry Christmas, happy Hanukkah, happy Kwanzaa, happy. Let's just bring the joy back into our lives.
And
Love
we
it.
wish you a season and a year full of responding with wonderment and awe. The opportunity to be present with people that you're connected to. That's all what we wish for you. So, and Brian, Barbara, thank you for joining us live in the conversation. And again, stay tuned for updates on all of our fun opportunities next year, including the conference. Take care, everyone.